If you hear knocking at 3 a.m. in Appalachia, don't answer, because deep in the Appalachian Mountains outside Elkmont, it was never trying to get in. In September of 2017, on a stretch of private land bordering the Elkmont Historic District in the Great Smoky Mountains, a burnt-out writer rented a $400 a month cabin from the last family in the valley who refused to sell to the Park Service. He thought total isolation was exactly what his overdue manuscript needed. He didn't know the cabin came with a rule: never answer the door between 2:59 and 3:01 a.m. By the end of his 7th night, he'd be standing in a rental office covered in blood that wasn't his, holding a knife he didn't remember picking up. And the county clerk's office had a file on that address going back to 1911. Only one tenant on record ever talked about what the knocking was. He took it back 3 days later. What you're about to hear is what happened to the man who didn't. His name is Garrett Sowers. Two weeks earlier, Garrett was forklift certified and unemployed, technically a novelist, more accurately a man 8 months past a book deadline his publisher had quietly stopped emailing him about. His laptop bag still carried a TSA tag from a pitch trip to New York, back when he still believed the book existed somewhere past chapter 4. He found the listing on a Tuesday between rejected pitches. A cabin on private land outside Elkmont. $400 a month, quiet, underlined in the title. Mrs. Carver met him at the gate, the last holdout on land the Park Service had been trying to buy since the 70s. She handed him a folded index card before the keys, her grip lingering on it a second longer than it needed to. Most of the rules were ordinary. The last line wasn't. Never answer the door between 2:59 and 3:01 a.m. He asked why a rental this remote needed a rule about a door. She said the rule was older than the rental, older than her, and didn't say which fact should have worried him more. The door itself had no lock, just a hand-forged iron crossbar bolted into brackets on either side of the frame, built, it seemed, to keep something in, not out. His father would have hated that door. 40 years a locksmith, a man who'd fitted deadbolts into half the houses in their county, and he used to say the only doors worth building were the ones that kept people out. Garrett had always figured it was a strange thing for a man who'd never once been robbed to be so afraid of the other direction. One of those sayings a person files away as harmless, right up until it isn't. He noticed the notches on his way in. 6 shallow marks cut into the door frame at shoulder height, spaced too evenly to be casual. A pull-up count, maybe. Some kid's height chart from summers ago. He filed it under harmless too and moved his bags inside and didn't think about it again. Not that night. Not the next morning. Though later he'd wonder why something that specific hadn't snagged in his mind even a little. That first night, he dropped the crossbar into its brackets and felt ridiculous doing it, the iron cold against his palms. He fell asleep sometime after midnight, manuscript open on his lap, and didn't notice, not then, not for a long while after, that somewhere past the porch line, nothing outside the cabin was making a sound at all. Night 3, Garrett set up his phone on the mantel, angled at the door, mostly out of boredom. He told himself it was atmospheric B-roll for later, something to post when the book finally sold. He didn't expect to use it. He didn't expect to watch it back the next morning and see himself get out of bed at 2:58, walk to the door in a straight line, and lift the crossbar halfway out of its bracket. He stood there on the video, 47 seconds, rigid, facing the door, both hands on the bar. Then he set it back down and shuffled to bed like nothing happened. He had zero memory of it. Garrett sat on the edge of the mattress with his coffee going cold, playing it back 3 times. The 4th time through, He noticed his feet in the footage were already dirty when he stood up. Not tracked in dirty. Packed in dirty, like something ground into the treads of his soles hours before he ever got out of bed. He checked his actual feet next. Same thing. Dirt under the nails, cold in a way Dew never got. The kind of cold from somewhere the sun hasn't touched in longer than a season. The cabin floor was bone dry. He checked twice. He almost let it go there. Almost filed it as sleepwalking, a weird one-off, something to laugh about someday, until he passed the door frame on his way to make more coffee and counted the notches out of nervous habit, the way you check a locked door twice even after you've already checked it. 6 the first night. 7 now. He hadn't touched the wood. Nobody had. He ran his thumb over the newest cut, and it wasn't rough like fresh carving. It was smooth, worn down like something made a long time ago, and only just now showing up. He told himself the same story people tell themselves. Maybe he'd counted wrong. Maybe the light was bad. He believed it for about as long as it took to walk to the kitchen, which is to say, he didn't believe it at all. He just needed somewhere to put the fear so it would sit still long enough to function. Outside, the wind had picked up sometime after breakfast, strong enough to bend the tops of the oaks along the ridge and rattle the porch screen against its frame. Garrett noticed it because the tree line toward the old resort ruins, a half-collapsed lodge nobody had touched since the 60s, visible past the fence line from the porch, wasn't moving at all. Every other tree in the hollow leaned with the gusts. That stand held dead still, rooted somewhere the wind couldn't reach. He didn't walk down to look closer. He told himself it was the angle of the ridge blocking the gusts. He didn't check whether that made sense, because checking meant walking toward it, and some decisions get made by the body before the brain signs off. By afternoon, he'd gone through every window latch twice, checked the crossbar 3 times, and unplugged the coffee maker for no reason except that his hands needed a job. He caught himself at the door frame again, palm flat against the wood, feeling for the 7th notch like it might tell him something if he pressed hard enough. It was warm. Not cabin temperature warm. Warm like something recently touched. He pulled his hand back fast enough to knock his coffee mug off the side table, and it took a full minute standing over the broken pieces before he remembered to breathe normally again. That evening, he sat on the porch steps longer than he meant to, watching the light drop out of the hollow fast, the ridgeline eating the sun a good hour before it would have gone down anywhere flat. He had his laptop open on his knees. He didn't write a word. He kept thinking about his father, and the thing the old man used to say about doors, and how it had never once sounded like advice worth taking. Right up until tonight, dirt under his fingernails he couldn't account for, watching a tree line that wouldn't move. By morning, Garrett decided he needed a different kind of answer than a tally mark could give him. He drove the winding 40 minutes into Gatlinburg, telling himself the whole way it was research, the kind of thing a serious writer does, pull property records, confirm dates, make the fiction feel real. He didn't examine why his hands stayed tight on the wheel the entire drive. The Sevier County Clerk's office sat in a low brick building off the main strip, the kind of place tourists never wandered into by accident. Garrett gave the address at the counter and watched a woman in her 50s, name tag reading DEB, pull up the parcel on her monitor. She went quiet reading it, not confused quiet, recognizing quiet. "You're not the first one to come ask about that particular address," she said, already turning to the microfiche cabinet before he'd even asked the question forming in his head. The land, she told him, was one of the last private holdouts bordering the Elkmont Historic District, a stretch the Park Service had circled for decades and never closed the deal on. Before the national park swallowed the rest of the valley, it had been a working logging community, then briefly a resort stop for people coming up from Knoxville by rail. The cabin Garrett was renting had stood on that land since 1911. She slid the folder across the counter. 7 names. 7 dates spread across more than 100 years, each one logged the same clinical way. Found deceased, exposure, wooded terrain adjacent to structure. Every one of them barefoot when found. Every one of them facing the cabin. Garrett read it twice, the paper cold under the office's air conditioning, and felt himself already building the explanation. Old land. People used to die out there for less mysterious reasons. Exposure, moonshine, bad luck. A hollow that got cold fast once the sun dropped behind the ridge. He could feel the rational version of the story assembling itself brick by brick, the same way he built any plot. Find the explanation that lets everyone go back to sleep. And that was the exact moment he heard his father's voice, unwanted, clear as if the man were standing at his shoulder in the fluorescent light of a county records office, 3 states from where he'd died. The only doors worth building are the ones that keep people out. Garrett had spent his whole life hearing that line as a punchline, an old locksmith superstition, a man who fitted deadbolts for 40 years and somehow still slept with a hall light on. He didn't repeat it out loud now. He just felt it land somewhere behind his sternum, and the rational explanation he'd been building came apart a little at the seams. "There's one more thing," Deb said, sliding a second sheet across, this one newer, typed instead of handwritten. Back in 1973, fella named Talmadge Kessler rented that cabin for about 2 weeks, filed a formal complaint about knocking at night, wanted it in writing, wanted the county to do something about it. What happened? Retracted it 3 full days later. Only thing he ever said on the record after that was 3 words. She turned the sheet so Garrett could read it himself. "I understand now. No further explanation. No follow-up complaint." Talmadge Kessler's file ended there, flat and unfinished. The kind of gap that should have had more behind it, and simply didn't. Garrett thanked her too fast and left before she could ask if he was doing okay, which she looked like she wanted to. On his way out, hand already on the door, she added it almost like an afterthought. The kind of detail a person mentions on the way out, because it only just occurred to them, not because they think it matters. Every one of the 7 deaths going all the way back had happened on or after the 7th night of a stay. Never before. Never after. Garrett sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long while before he started the engine, doing math he didn't want the answer to. He was on night 5. Night 7, Garrett didn't try to sleep. He set the phone on the mantel again, angled at the door, battery topped off, storage cleared. He dragged the armchair 3 feet closer to the crossbar so he'd feel it if his own hand so much as twitched toward it. He told himself that was the whole plan. Stay conscious, stay in the chair, watch whatever wanted to happen happen, and this time, remember it. The cabin held the kind of dark that doesn't exist in a city. No streetlight bleed, no distant headlights sweeping the ceiling. Just the orange pinprick of the phone's recording light and the shape of the crossbar in its brackets, 6 feet away, waiting. At 2:41, Garrett's legs were bouncing. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs to stop them, and they started again 30 seconds later. At 2:50, the temperature in the room dropped enough that he could see his breath, and he told himself it was just the mountain doing what mountains do after midnight, and he didn't believe it even as he thought it. At 2:56, he caught himself gripping the arms of the chair like they were the only solid thing left, knuckles pale, his own pulse loud in his ears. 3 knocks landed at 2:58, 2 minutes early. The rule had always been 259 to 301, the one boundary Garrett had built his entire understanding of the situation around, and it had just been broken before he'd even had the chance to decide whether he was brave enough to test it. He opened his mouth to say something, to himself, to the door, to nobody. And his body was already moving. Not deciding to move, moving. His legs carried him out of the chair before his brain caught up to what they were doing, and he watched his own hand reach for the crossbar the way you watch a stranger's hand in a dream, present and helpless at the same time, screaming inside a skull that wasn't taking instructions from him anymore. The last thing he registered, whole and clear, was the sound the bar made sliding out of its bracket. A low grinding scrape of iron against iron, a sound he already knew better than his own name, because his hand had made that exact sound every single night this week, whether he remembered it or not. Then nothing. No transition, no falling, no dream logic dissolve. Just an edge, and then the other side of it. Garrett came back to himself standing under fluorescent light, and it took several full seconds to understand the light was coming from the ceiling of the rental office in town. The same office where he'd signed his lease 8 days earlier. Wood paneling, a bell above the door, a calendar still flipped to August. His shirt was soaked through. Not sweat. Too dark for sweat. Too heavy. Already going tacky at the collar. There was a knife in his right hand. He didn't recognize the handle. He didn't remember his fingers closing around it. And yet they were closed around it now. Knuckles white, like they'd been holding it for a very long time and had simply forgotten to let go. Across the counter, the property manager, a heavy-set man Garrett had exchanged maybe 40 words with on move-in day, stood frozen mid-sentence, phone already halfway to his ear, his face doing the specific kind of stillness that happens right before a person starts screaming. Garrett looked down at himself, looked at the blood, looked at the knife. He set it on the counter gently, the way you'd set down something you were afraid might go off, and walked out the door before the manager's mouth finished catching up with what his eyes were seeing. He drove straight back to the cabin. He didn't decide to. His hands just did it, the same way they'd done everything else that night, following some instruction his conscious mind had never been given. He sat frozen in the driveway, with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring past the fence line at the dead still stand of trees around the old resort ruins, the only thing in the whole hollow that had never once moved with the wind. The cabin door stood open behind him, exactly as he'd left it, or exactly as something had left it. That's when the deputy's flashlight found him. The knock on the window snapped him back into his own head so hard it felt physical, a full-body jolt, and for one disoriented second, Garrett thought it was the cabin door again, thought he was still inside it, still 2 minutes early. Behind him, through the open cabin door, the flashlight beam swept once across the frame at shoulder height. 8 notches now. Cleared after 72 hours. No charges filed, no missing person on record anywhere in Sevier County or the next county over, or any county the sheriff's department bothered checking. The knife had no prints on it besides his own, which the detective mentioned like it was supposed to make him feel better. Garrett learned the rest almost in passing, the way you'd mention the weather, the blood on his shirt, on his hands, dried into the creases of his knuckles, had already been dead for 48 hours before it ever touched his skin. 48 hours. Which meant whatever happened to whoever it belonged to had already happened before Garrett ever picked up that knife, before he even sat down in the armchair that night. The detective didn't have an explanation for that either, and didn't pretend to. Nobody ever identified whose blood it was. Nobody ever explained where it came from, or how it ended up on a man who'd spent the entire night locked inside a cabin with an iron bar across the only door. The file closed the way Talmadge Kessler's file had closed 50 years earlier. Flat, unfinished, a gap nobody filled. Garrett moved out that week. He didn't go back for his deposit. 6 months later, he was living in an apartment 2 states away, the manuscript finally finished, 310 pages sitting in a folder on his desktop, with a title he hadn't consciously chosen. Every page was about a cabin outside Elkmont. A rule about a door. A man who almost made it 7 nights without breaking it. His publisher, who'd gone quiet for 2 years, wrote back within the hour of receiving it, calling it the best thing he'd ever turned in. He read it back once, cover to cover, and couldn't say for certain whether he'd written it or simply remembered it and typed it down word for word, like taking dictation from something that had already lived through it. That was the week the email came. A new listing, same rental site he'd used before, sitting quiet in his inbox, like it had somehow always belonged there. Same address bordering Elkmont. Same $400 a month. Same word. Quiet, underlined in the title. 0 reviews. Garrett didn't remember signing up for alerts on that property. He checked his settings twice to be sure. There was nothing there that should have sent it to him. He still has the photograph he took the last morning, the one on his phone he can't bring himself to delete. The door frame, 8 notches deep, the newest one still pale against the older, weathered cuts, like it hadn't finished healing yet. He never went back. But some nights, working late on whatever comes after the manuscript, he catches himself listening for something he can't quite name. Some sound the mountain used to make right before it made the sound that mattered. And some nights, the silence lasts a beat too long before he remembers to breathe again. The clerk's file on that address is still open in Sevier County. 8 names now, though only 7 are dated. The 8th line just says pending, in the same clinical hand as all the others, waiting on whoever comes to fill it in. Somewhere outside Elkmont, on land the Park Service still hasn't managed to buy, a door with no lock is still standing exactly where it's always stood. And somewhere, on a shoulder-height stretch of that same old door frame, in wood that's been counting for over 100 years, there's room left for one more mark,